Hi again. I'm going to give a review this time on a detective book. Last book I gave was written over 100 years ago, a humorous book, comedy book. This one is to do with detective tales. I mean, most people like mystery tales, or whodunit, detective stories. So what I'm going to do is introduce you to one of my favourites. And it's Colin Dexter. You can't recommend one of Colin Dexter's books without recommending all of them. Once you've read one of them, you're going to want to read the rest of them. Colin Dexter invented the Chief Inspector Morse character with his trusty detective Sergeant Lewis. They're not long books. They're quite, about 200 or 300 pages. They're not long books, but they're great stories. The Chief Inspector Morse, he's a character that you get used to. You sometimes hate him, you sometimes love him. He's a smoker, but a cigarette smoker. Should have been told about the pipe. And he's always coughing and spluttering. He's a beer drinker, and in the evenings he likes his whiskey. Glenfiddich, how do you say that? Glenfiddich. He drives a Jaguar, an old Jaguar car. He loves classical music. He's an intellectual, really. And nothing he likes better in the evening is sitting down with his glass of whiskey, listening to some classical music, or reading classical books or poetry. He also speaks Latin, and he's often quoting Latin phrases to his sergeant, Lewis, who doesn't have a clue what he's talking about most of the time. Also, he's a very impulsive man. He often jumps into an idea thinking that he's solved the case, and very often he hasn't. Not at the beginning of the story, but he gradually works his way around it. He's a man that loves crossword puzzles. He takes the Times. Now, the Times is probably one of the most difficult crosswords in the world, if not, well, in London at least anyway, in Britain perhaps. And he can finish these crosswords in about 6 minutes, so he's very clever. And he has this crossword sort of mind. It reminds me of Sherlock Holmes in some ways, He works around a puzzle. He treats the murder mysteries like a crossword in some ways. And he works his way around it until he comes up with the answer. He's very mean. Often when they go out for a drink, he tells Lewis, let's go for a pint. They go in for a pint, and then it's Lewis that ends up paying for it more often than not, He's a bachelor. He lives in a bachelor flat, surrounded by his records and his books. Now, Detective Lewis is a different character. He likes his beer, but he also likes. He's not an intellectual. He doesn't like fine foods like Morse does. He just is quite happy with his bacon, egg and chips sort of food. And but he's also what you might call he's a catalyst, which triggers Morse to thinking around a problem and coming up with an answer. He relies upon Lewis to say things to him, to come up with ideas, which gives him the idea to the answer to the mystery, to the problem in the long term. I think the best thing I do is read a little section for you. I've marked a piece off here somewhere. Mrs. Rodway wiped her tears and blew her nose noisily. He said, "It was always difficult to apportion blame in life, but he said if he had to blame anyone, it would be the students." "Is that all?" asked Morse. "Yes." "Why was that an odd thing to say, though?" "Because, you see, he was always on the students' side, always." So it was a bit like hearing a trade union boss suddenly siding with the Conservative Party. "Thank you. You've been very kind, Mrs. Rodway." Clearly, as Lewis could see, it was time to depart, and he closed his notebook with what might have passed for a slight flourish, had anyone been interested enough to observe the gesture. But equally clearly, as Lewis could see, Morse was momentarily transfixed. The blue eyes gleamed with that strangely distant, almost ethereal glaze which Lewis had observed so often before, a gaze which usually betokened a break-in in a major case, or a breakthrough in a major case, I should say. As now, the three of them then rose to their feet. "Did you get to university yourself?" asked Morse. "No, I left school at 16, went to a posh secretarial college, did well, got a good job, had a nice boss, became his PA, and he married me. As I told you, Inspector, he's got a weakness for his PAs." Morse nodded. "Just one last question. When did your husband leave you?" "I told you, don't you remember? 4 years ago." Suddenly her voice sounded sharp. "When exactly?" Mrs. Rodway's sound. Suddenly Morse's voice too sounded sharp. "November the 5th, bonfire night. Now I'm not likely to forget that day, am I?" "Not quite 4 years ago then." Mrs. Rodway made no further reply. So that gives you a brief idea of what to expect from a Morse novel. They're great novels. I'm sure if you read one, then you're going to read them all. And you should start off with perhaps The Last Bus to Woodstock, and then follow through with The Last Seen Wearing, then The Silent World of Nicholas Quinn, The Service of All the Dead, The Dead of Jericho, The Riddle of the Third Mile, The Secret of Annex 3, The Wench is Dead, The Jewel That Was Ours, The Way Through the Woods, and there are more, but I won't read them anymore. Once you start reading them, I'm sure you'll collect all of them, like me. He's one of my favourite novelists. I love detective stories, and the next time I'll introduce you to some of the detective stories that I love, or writers of detective stories. I've got several that I find I come back to again and again. Well, I hope I've intrigued you enough to go out and buy yourself a Colin Dexter Chief Inspector Morse book. Till the next time, have a good day.